How's it going, everybody? This is Rusty here at FCP Euro. Today we're going to show you how to replace your water pump in your B58 equipped G01 X3 M40i. Now what we have in front of me on the table is a kit we've compiled for the water pump replacement on our G01 X3. The kit contains the charge air pipe gaskets that we'll need, a couple of coolant O-rings that are fixed to the water pump as well, along with the water pump assembly, a couple of the radiator support bracket bolts for the upper radiator support, along with a drive belt tensioner tool, and additionally some coolant. So a couple of things you want to keep in mind as you are looking at your vehicle, checking it over, making sure you have no fluid leaks, is the water pump can actually leak from the weep hole down below and additionally from the pulley behind here. And if you are considering replacing your water pump and it is actually actively leaking coolant, you may also want to consider a drive belt replacement, which will have an entire DIY on the drive belt and tensioner along with this as well. So the service interval is not exactly a time frame that is standard. They've leaked as low as 20 to 30,000 miles all the way up past 100,000 miles. Our vehicle has about 80,000 miles on it, and it is just starting to show some signs of leaks from the weep hole and from the pulley, which we'll show you in a little bit here. Now, the drive belt tool right here is not something you're going to be using for replacement, but it is included in the kit as it may be required to make your life a little bit easier in locking the drive belt tensioner in place. Additionally, you may also need some extra coolant. This vehicle does have an auxiliary radiator as the intercooler is built into the intake manifold. So the 1 gallon of coolant may be okay for some vehicles, but you may want to have a little bit of extra coolant on hand just in case you need a little top off. And with that, let's get into the tools. All right, now for the tools we're going to need for today's DIY. For starters, refilling the cooling system, we will absolutely need a cooling filling device, and we're going to be using the U-View coolant fill device. Accompanying that, you will need an air line and an air compressor to operate that device. You can certainly get the job done without it. However, you could create an air bubble in the system and also create some overheating concerns. So it is strongly advised, almost necessary to have this, and will alleviate from any concerns. Now for the rest of the basic tools, we do have a couple of flashlights handy. I have an impact driver with an 8mm magnetic socket that will be handy for the belly pan screws, a small scraper device for cleaning up some of the ceiling surfaces, a 90-degree pick, a small pocket screwdriver, 1/4-inch ratchet, a couple of small variations and longer variations of a T30 socket in 3/8 and 1/4-inch drive, an E14 external torque socket, a 10mm socket, a 13mm socket, 16mm socket, as well as a 6 and an 8mm socket. Additionally, I have a T20 screwdriver, a small panel tool, and then also a little mirror, a 3/8 drive ratchet, a long radiator pick, a long panel tool, small pry bar, and a 3/8 torque wrench. Additionally, not pictured here, you will need a coolant drain, some way to get the vehicle up in the air, and then I've also taken the time to make a small cover for our radiator to keep the radiator from getting damaged while working in that area. And with that, let's go ahead and get into the repair. All right, first thing we need to do is gain some access. There's a lot of plastic panels in this car, so we're going to start by making a pile of plastic. Coming up to the cowl here, there is a little thumb screw on each of these corner panels. Once you turn that thumb screw 90 degrees, you can lift it up and pull it out. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. On this one, our thumb screw is actually missing, so quite simply just lift it up and take it out. The front panels and side panels will need to come out. Some of these you may be able to grab with your fingernails and pull out the center pin. Some of them you may also need a little panel tool. So we're going to go through and get all of these rivets off and remove all 4 of these plastic panels. And you can either remove the washer reservoir cap or push it through the little rubber doorway like I did. And then once the trim panel comes out, you will have to scoop this out from underneath the hood. The back corner of this is a little bit tucked under that hood hinge. Now moving on to the front panel, keep going with those clips. We'll have to remove the hood seal slightly. Hood seal is basically just snapped in place. So using the panel tool, you can release the 4 plastic plugs or Christmas tree clips, some people call these as well. We'll get those off to the side in our pile of plastic rivets. And then continuing up on the driver's side here, you'll notice the hood cable does have a little provision here. So we'll get all these rivets out and we'll flip that over and try to carefully release that. So with these clips here, you just kind of want to squeeze them slightly. All right, now we need to get these front strut braces out of our way. They do have an E14 external Torx in the back and a 16 millimeter on the front radiator support. These are reversible side to side, so it doesn't really matter. However, you can only install them one way and they will not sit correctly. So if you'd like to, leave the bolts in the ends and then set these off to either side so that you don't mix them up and you know exactly how they are orientated. And now we'll do the same on the driver's side. Now let's go ahead and get this upper radiator panel off. The hood cable is kind of popped in place there, so simply just pull towards the front of the car and get that loosened up. And then it's going to be a series of T30s all throughout the top of that aluminum panel. Now you'll notice the posts on the bottom of this. Careful when you're guiding this back down into place, and also when you're lifting it up, these may be stuck a little bit. They just kind of keep the radiator in place. Once this is removed, the radiator can move a little bit. And again, these just kind of locate the radiator in the proper position. So keep that in mind when removing and reinstalling those. And now we're going to work on getting this upper radiator support out. There are 4 more T30s in the front before we can go on to the main body bolts. Now moving on to the 13 millimeters on the body side of this radiator support brace. Keep in mind, there are 13 millimeters coming out. Now once we've loosened this up, there is a harness that runs along the bottom of this, so you'll need your panel tool once again, just to break free that harness from this little bracket here. Now, if you haven't already, now's a good time to go ahead and lift the engine cover off. It's just kind of pressed on with the rubber grommets. Next up, we're going to work on getting our air box out. There is a T20 that holds this little baffle in the back along with this connector here. And once we get this clamp off, the air box should come out quite easily. So for the connector, you're just going to use your thumb or a pocket screwdriver to pull this white lock back. Pressing that white lock and then pulling the connector off. Then we're going to use a 6 millimeter to release this clamp and a T20 for the screw in the back. And once that clamp is released, kind of just wiggle that charge pipe off, get that loosened up, and then just go ahead and pull straight up on the box and get that out of your way. All right, now that we've got our air box out, we need to go ahead and release this air inlet. So there are a couple of coolant hoses that are kind of stuck in here. You can get that popped out there, and then it starts to loosen up. There is a little bit of a wire harness that wraps around, and that is kind of clipped into the breather. So we can kind of just loosen that up. And there is one connector on the air boot down there that we'll have to pop off. All right, in order to get to the clip on this charge pipe, I'm going to release this breather hose here, which has little squeeze clamps on the top of the valve cover here. Get that loosened up, and then I've popped the clip down on the charge air inlet. So that's just loose enough that I can get my hand onto. Taking this out is going to make it a lot easier to get to that clip on the turbo inlet, and then furthermore onto the fresh air inlet on the back side of the turbo inlet that we'll have to mess around with. These are corrugated hoses underneath the foam here, so be very careful, but that's another reason to get it out of your way so that you don't break it, and just be careful when pulling it off. So we'll set that off to the side and get that out of our way. So the release for the clip right here is actually going to be located towards the bottom, which I'm going in kind of blind, getting my pick underneath and pulling that into the unlocked position. Oh, and it looks like I popped it out. And luckily it's a fairly large clip. I just was able to get my pick underneath this, pull it out, and then we can reinsert this before reassembly. And now that we have the clip out, we can gently release the turbo inlet to give us just enough room. Put our hand down and release that little air fitting, breather fitting, whatever this is, on the air inlet. Easier said than done. You may need a pick. And as you can see, there was a lot of dirt and debris caked up on that fitting, making it very difficult to release. What you're going to need to do is try to get your hand down there and squeeze these little textured ends 90 degrees away from the little tabs that hang down over the lip here. And if you're unable to squeeze those tabs, you can get a pick underneath the sides so that you clear this little bevel on here. We'll get this cleaned up before we reinstall that, as well as the other end there, just to make our lives a little bit easier going back together. But there's a lot of grease there. We got a decent amount of oil dripping out of there from the PCV system. We'll make sure to clean that too before reinstallation. All right, and before we continue proceeding, now that we have the turbo inlet exposed, grab a bag, a rag, or something to cover up that turbo inlet, because any debris or dirt that gets in there is going to cause some problems. So I'm just going to cover that up so that we don't get anything in there while we're working in this area. Now we're going to move on to releasing some of these radiator hoses, this auxiliary water pump, and also removing that fan shroud in order to gain access to that charge air pipe. Then we can finally get to the main repair. There is a large connector on the passenger side that we will need to release, and there is a little bit of a harness hold down on that radiator shroud as well. So we're just going to pop that off there, releasing the wire harness. There's also another connector on the side of the radiator that is built into this harness as well. Let's get this out with the white lock. Get that connector out. Then once that's all loosened up, there is a little clip, and then you should be able to depress that and pull it up out of the way. This is a fairly large clip, so if you are having difficulty removing this, push the connection down, then release the clip, then pull back up all at the same time. That should get the clip out of the way. But let's keep going on that. Just gonna pop these radiator hoses out of the shroud. There's a couple more down below that you guys aren't gonna really be able to see. Now on the radiator fan shroud, there are some pretty heavy duty, but also somewhat fragile clips. So it is gonna be a little bit of a finesse to release those, but have enough tension not to break them. So I'll pry the clip backwards while pulling the fan shroud in an upward motion all at the same time. Now slide this up and out of your way. Careful of those radiator hoses. All right, now that we have our radiator fan shroud out, the radiator is rather exposed in the back area. We will be working in this area doing this DIY, so you may want to keep this covered if you're not considering replacing the radiator. A screwdriver could go through it and poke a hole, or you could simply bend the fins and restrict cooling flow. So I've gone ahead and taken a piece of cardboard, cut it to fit, and we'll be sliding that right behind the radiator so that we can protect the radiator from any dings, dents, scratches, anything like that. So do yourself a favor, take the box that your parts have come in, cut it up, and align it to fit inside of the radiator fan shroud here. So now we've also got a little lip to work on, so the radiator is not going to be cutting us, but let's keep going and get this charge air pipe out. There is a clip located down here, a couple of sensors up here, and two T30s on the throttle body. We're going to start on that lower end of the charge pipe and get that released. Now with either a large flathead screwdriver or what I have here is a long radiator pick, similar to the turbo inlet pipe we took out for the airbox, just need to get underneath it and release that clip. Once it starts to get loosened up, we can completely remove it so we don't lose it in the engine bay. We've got that end of it loosened up, so we still have to release these two T30s, and we're going to also start by removing these two sensors on the top here. These do have the white lock, which you should be familiar with now. I'm going to get a screwdriver in there. We can get those out of our way. Now we're going to work on those two T30s at the top of the charge air pipe. Now this charge air pipe should come out of the throttle body rather easily, and we've already loosened that lower pipe. One more coolant hose holding it in. And this is a perfect example of why we put the cardboard there, because I just drug this map sensor and intake air temp sensor all the way across there. Radiator is perfectly fine, so keep that in mind before you go ahead and take that charge pipe out. All right, now before we actually take off the belt, let's take a second to just write up a little map. Obviously, you could take a picture of this if you'd like. Personally, I like to do a little drawing and basically map out how the belt is routed. So grab your old tensioner box or a piece of cardboard. I'm going to draw the crank pulley fairly large, label it C. The water pump is a little bit smaller, W. And then we have the alternator and tensioner, and then the AC. And the belt just goes around the AC, up to the alternator, through the tensioner, under the water pump, around the crank, and in that direction. I'm no artist, but do whatever you got to do. Take a picture, Make sure you know exactly how that belt is routed. It will likely only go on one way, and if you put it on another way, you could cause some noises, some overheating, charging issues, anything like that. So take note of that belt routing before you take it off. All right, now we're working on the drive tensioner. We do have to loosen the tensioner and lock it into the position that you currently see your new one in. The old one will need a 16 millimeter to go on to this little nub here, and then you're going to rotate it counterclockwise. The locking position down in here is at the 6 o'clock position in the vehicle. However, there is also a locking position at about the 2 o'clock position, if you will. It doesn't matter which one you use, but you will most likely be able to access the top one a lot easier than the lower one. So we'll go ahead and do that now and show you exactly what we're talking about. Firmly pry the ratchet out. You'll expose that lock pin, and we can put that in, release that. That'll make the belt much easier to come off. The ability to use both of your hands and work that belt around. All right, now with a 13 millimeter, we're gonna go ahead and release this tensioner. All right, now that we can physically see the water pump, let's get underneath the car, take off some belly pans, and start draining the coolant. All right, we're gonna go ahead and remove this front center belly pan along with both side pans. And you can also go ahead and remove this cloth belly pan, as any coolant will get on this, you will see it will more than likely stain it. So get all these panels out of the way, making cleanup a lot easier in the end. 8 millimeter on all these screws. All right, now that we've got all that out of the way, we're ready to go ahead and drain our cooling system. So go ahead and get yourself a catch pan in the right front corner. The lower radiator hose is not exactly on the lowest point of the radiator, so we will not be able to drain all of the coolant out of the radiator. So keep that in mind as you're working. It may continue to drain a little bit. So we'll get the car back down, get our coolant bucket underneath the vehicle, and pop off that lower hose. Now go ahead and grab yourself a 90-degree pick or a small pocket screwdriver. Just something you're gonna need to release that clip on the lower radiator hose. And I did pull the cardboard out of this area so that it doesn't get soaked with coolant. So just be careful when you're working around that radiator. I'm gonna crack the coolant cap so that we don't get a rush of coolant. And then carefully pull that back, hopefully not splashing too much, and let this thing drain. There we go. So once that slows draining, we'll release that from that coupler and kind of tip that hose down, starting to drain out whatever is left in that water pump. You'll notice this lower radiator hose is directly connected to that water pump. So any water we can get out now will make the water pump a little bit less of a sloppy job. Now that we have the coolant drained, we're gonna go ahead and remove this auxiliary water pump here. It does have another one of those white lock connectors. So we'll get that lock out of the way, depress that, and get that connector up and away. There's a 10 millimeter that fastens the bracket on, and then there's this coolant hose that goes to the lower radiator hose. It'll probably be a little bit easier if we just undo this coolant hose that goes to the lower radiator hose, just to give us a little bit more flexibility. So with a 90-degree pick, I'm gonna get underneath this hose, pop that out, wiggle that off, and then we should be able to drain that water pump a little better. I'll take a 10 mil, release that bracket. Once that 10 millimeter nut is released, you may need a little pry tool or a screwdriver to just pull that bracket up. And then that should come out nice and easily. And then we will just take the water pump, and it's stuck to that bracket. And we're just gonna kind of swing that off to the side, getting that out of our way. Now on the outside of the water pump, there is this coolant hose that goes from the cylinder head to the front of the water pump. There are 4 T30s that hold this in place. We're gonna go ahead and release those now. This water pump connection is gonna turn slightly and then come out. All right. So based on what's happened here, this hose has completely come apart. It is suggested to get this completely out of the way, but for you people at home, if you don't have this complete hose, I would suggest just undoing these 3 bolts, pivoting the hose out of the way, and removing the water pump this way to alleviate from any cracking or deforming of this hose, as you can see here. However, with that, our car has about 80,000 miles, and obviously it is time to replace this hose. While we're in there, we're gonna be replacing that water pump. It would be silly to do all this coolant repair and then go down the road, and then that basically starts to leak. So take it for what it's worth, but you may want to consider the replacement of this entire hose while you're in there. But let's go into our parts department and see if we have one of these in stock. All right, continuing with our T30 trend, go ahead and get this flange. Now we can get this hose out of our way. Let me get this little O-ring out of here as well. And now we've got a bunch of T30s on the outside of the pump. So reference your new pump to see exactly where those pieces of hardware are. But let's go ahead and get those out. All right, let's see if this pops off. You may need to pry it out of there. So there is a little tab on the top of the water pump that'll allow you to pry that off. And once you do, let that drain. We should be able to release this pump in theory. All right, let that thing drain out. And now that we got this out of our way, you can see where it was leaking from that weep hole down below, also starting on this side, and a little bit from that drain on the bottom. But now that we have this out of our way, we can clean up that sealing surface and continue with reinstallation. So we've cleaned up the sealing surface with the water pump. Didn't use anything abrasive, really just used a shop towel, some brake clean, and just removed some of the rubber debris from the old gasket. But there's no sealant, there's nothing to really scrape away. It should be a nice clean metal surface when you're done. On the water pump itself, there is a flange here that connects to the radiator hose. If you look closely, the three bolt holes here are threaded and this one is not. So before we install this, to make our lives a little bit easier, we're going to take the bolt that goes to that flange and just run it in, and using that to make some threads. You could obviously use an M6 by, looks like 1.5 tap, but we're going to use the bolt that was removed from that flange and just set some threads in there to start. I don't know why they did that. I'm not really quite sure, but it would definitely be a little bit more difficult trying to run that bolt in with it all installed, and then we could get some metal shavings in the cooling system while doing that. So we're going to take a second on the bench to just run this bolt in, clean it out with some compressed air, and then get ready to install that water pump. So go ahead and stick the bolt in that flange. You may be able to get it started by hand. Try to keep it straight. We obviously don't want to break the plastic impeller. Once you get it started, back it off a little bit. All right, so you will notice that it is a blind hole in there. You will bottom the bolt out. You'll notice a lot of resistance while you're cutting the threads, but there'll be significantly more resistance once you bottom that out. So be careful not to push too far once you get to that point. You may end up snapping that bolt in your brand new water pump. Here's a little bit of rubber right here. Use a carbide scraper to remove a little bit of that so it doesn't disrupt our new pump, but a little of that residue isn't going to mess up your seal. And then one thing we want to keep in mind when we're going back together, make sure these two locating dowels are still present in the block. If the vehicles do begin to age, there's a potential that these can get corroded into the water pump and actually become removed from the block, and you'd have to pound them out of the old water pump in the locating pins and transfer them back over to the block. So ours are still in there. We're ready to go ahead and install this. Once you find those locating pins, will not immediately sit flush. You may have to rock it into place. And then just kind of look around to see how flush it sits against the block. But if you did have a little bit of corrosion built up on those pins, it may not sit all the way against the block. So keep that in mind, and then we'll go ahead and install our bolts all around the pump. There should be about 6 T30s. All right, now that we've got those in, I'm just gonna run them in by hand before going back and torquing them to spec. All right, we're gonna be torquing the water pump to engine block bolts to 10.5 Newton meters. Now there's not necessarily a specific sequence. However, when doing anything with multiple bolts, it is advised to do it in a diagonal pattern. Alrighty, water pump's installed. Now, if you guys remember from earlier, we still have to extract a portion of that coolant hose. And as advised earlier, definitely want to, if you have the ability to, just shift that hose out of the way or have that hose handy. I imagine with it being so close to the exhaust here, it is always going to more or less be brittle plastic. So we want to get behind this flange here and make sure nothing falls in there. There's the O-ring. Here's part of the plastic. Run your pick. Oh, nails on a chalkboard. All right, and now I'm going to clean up all this gunk here with a rag and maybe even a little bit of a Brillo pad to make sure that that new flange slides in there nice and easily. Actually, that cleaned up fairly well without anything abrasive. Still got a nice machine surface, but you do want to put a little bit of grease on that new flange so that it slides in there without ripping that O-ring. All right, so we do want to grab our lower radiator hose that goes into the water pump here. And we do have included in the kit some new O-rings. Try to carefully remove this without destroying the flange. So in the kit, we do have a new O-ring. We're going to swap that over. As you can see, that has certainly been flattened out, destroyed. And clean up that sealing surface a little bit, but it is plastic, so don't use anything abrasive. Roll a new O-ring on there, and either with some coolant or Vaseline or some silicone grease, go ahead and lubricate that seal before reinstalling. Alrighty, we're going to feed this in, and then we're going to use the last and final bolt that has a little collar on it, not to be confused with the 5 that we're going to be using for the water pipe. And keep in mind, this is that one that we had to rethread over at the bench. So if you did not do that, you may have difficulty hand threading that bolt in there. And we're going to be torquing this one just like the water pump bolts to 10.5 Newton meters. And as you saw earlier, we did have this flange here break on us. We've gone ahead and removed the little bits of that, cleaned out the sealing surface. Now we're ready to go install this. So this does have the last 5 T30 pieces of hardware that we should have for the water pump area. And I did go ahead and apply a little bit of grease to this O-ring, but you can certainly just go ahead and put a little coolant on there. Just be very careful when you're installing that into the cylinder head there. So we're going to put the flange side in first. May have to rock it back and forth a little just to line up bolt holes, and it is going to be a little hard to see. And then when you're feeding the bolts in, you may need to continue to rock the flange just to get those holes to line up a little easier. Just get those started by hand, and then we're going to go back and torque those T30s to 10 Newton meters. Now we should have 3 more bolts left for the final flange on the face of the water pump. Now that we've got that situated, we're going to just button up the cooling system so that we can pressure test everything before we all go back together. So we do have this radiator hose that we installed over here. Click that into place. Make sure that clip engages and you can't pull it off. And then we also have the auxiliary water pump sitting in this bracket up here. That one engages as well. Now we can go ahead and pressure test our cooling system before reassembly, making sure that we have no leaks and that it does hold vacuum. All right, we're going to be using the U-View cooling filling device, which you're going to need some compressed air for as well. So make sure your valve is closed, one way or the other. Attach your air line. We don't need any coolant just yet. We are just physically making sure that our cooling system is sealed. All right. Looks like we're in the green. Make sure that this thing holds for a little while we're continuing reassembly, but you can make sure this at least holds for about 5 to 10 minutes and you're good to go ahead and put everything back together. All right, looks like we're in the green. It's holding about 25 inches of mercury, so you could certainly continue with reassembly, leaving this coolant vacuum device hooked up and making sure that we are holding vacuum for the remainder of the repair. However, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this. I'm fairly confident we're good to go ahead and reassemble, but we'll get back to this once we are ready to fill the cooling system up. All right, now we're going to go ahead and reinstall that auxiliary water pump bracket. There is a little tang or tab, if you will, that will tip into the top of the bracket, and then that will drop down onto that stud on the bottom where we're going to reattach our 10mm nut. And we're going to be torquing that to 8 Newton meters, and we do have the connector for that as well. Now reinstalling this, if you recall, the tensioner was kind of pointed towards the 6 o'clock position with the lock down here, and we installed the tool up here, making it a little bit easier on removal. But it doesn't really matter where you put that, but just keep that in mind that it's not going to be in the same location. And then we do have the 3 new 13mm bolts. And now the 3 13mm for the tensioner are going to be torqued to 28 Newton meters. All right, now that we're ready to install the belt, keep in mind we did take a little second to make a diagram. If you did not do this, it shouldn't be terribly hard to get the belt back on, but just keep in mind that you will have to go around the crank, under the water pump, under the tensioner, and then through the tensioner around the alternator, down and around the AC, and back towards the crank. So we're going to get everything pretty much on there except for the alternator, and then I'll get that one on once we loosen the tensioner here. Start on the crank. That draped over there, and with a 16 we can turn the tensioner counterclockwise and get ready to pull that pin out. Pin is removed, tensioner may need the alternator turned on, or put the belt on the alternator first, and then roll it back around the tensioner just like that. All right, now we got our pin out. Our belt is routed. Just double check to make sure that the belt is sitting in the ribs and is not on the outside of anything. You can kind of run your hand around the crank to make sure that it is sitting in the provisions as well. But this belt does look like it is all sitting fairly good. So, all right, now before we go ahead and install our charge pipe, we will go ahead and replace the two seals. On the bottom, you'll have a green one, and on the top by the throttle body, you'll have a black one. The seals aren't necessarily obviously worn or cracking or anything like that, but with this being a charge air pipe, this could potentially create a boost leak, and this seal does feel rather hard. It does feel not as malleable as the new one. It is slightly deformed in the edges here, but overall it does look like it was holding. However, while we have this all apart, no better time to replace it than now. So, little peace of mind in ensuring we have no boost leaks or anything like that, ensuring that while we have it all apart, everything has been renewed. A little bit of oil from the inside of there on there to make that nice and smooth, and just like that, it's nice and installed. Grab yourself a small pick or a little screwdriver, pop that out, and just make sure that the you can kind of see here there is a smaller groove that is going to be on the inside, and then the U shape, if you will, is going to be towards the outside on the charge pipe. And then for the throttle body side, is very similar to that, except it is on the outside of the pipe as opposed to the inside. So we're just going to take a little pick here, pull that off, and again, the seal could be potentially reversed. However, it does want to go back to its natural state. The smoother side is going to be against the charge pipe, and the channeled side, if you will, or this ribbed side is going to be touching the throttle body. So just like we did with the charge pipe, stretch this over, make sure that's seated, and we can go ahead and reinstall this. And if you did take out the clip that we pulled out on removal, this is a great time to go ahead and install this. You are going to want to have this in place, as it will be very difficult to get installed. But the tangs on the clip are going to point towards the charge pipe itself, and then the center of this should engage, and that's actually what's going to lock that in place. So when we go to push this on, you should feel a series of clips making sure that is securely in place. So if you remember from removal, this did come out in a little bit of a weird way. So go underneath the radiator hose. All right, so behind the radiator hose, under in front of this unit here, down and around. Once it all lines up, you should be able to just push that onto the turbo down there. There we go. A little bit of rocking it back and forth, making sure that clip is firmly engaged. Pull on it a couple of times, and that should be good to go. So we do have this one clip for the radiator hose that pretty much fell back into place. Re-engage that. If I can get my hand down there. Again, making sure that is firmly on there. One hard, quick pull, and that'll pop off if that's not engaged. And then we got the throttle body portion, and we have two T30 screws to attach those back to the throttle body. All right, we also have the two connectors here. Clicking in the connector as well as engaging that white lock. And then we're going to go ahead and torque these two T30 bolts to the throttle body to 8 Newton meters. And if you used it, go ahead and remove your saver radiator cardboard piece. And we're going to try to hold these lines back out of the way. There is that crossover coolant pipe that will be attaching itself into these two clips. And when I was removing them, these did get a little bit hung up even though we opened these up. So I'm going to actually pull these both off, and we'll try to run these in once we get the fan fed down there. So the fan will be dropping down into the radiator onto these two tabs and then locking in on the two top corners. So keep that all in mind. We're going to really try to keep it slim up to the radiator so it doesn't drag on anything else. Make sure these coolant lines are out of your way, which they are probably going to fight you the whole time. And before you fully engage this into the top of the radiator, double check to make sure that the tabs are firmly into those little locating sections and click it into place. And if you did take them off, we're going to go ahead and try to fit these little holders for the coolant hose down onto that fan shroud. So on this hose right here, there will be a little white line right there where that's going to be fitted right onto that. And then we can pop that back into place there. And then the next one over might be a little bit tougher to get to. All right, once you get it around that, close to lining up in the hole, and then try to tighten up the clamp, and that is where it should rest. Now up top here, we do have a couple other additional coolant hoses. However, we want to get the radiator fans plugged in as well. So get that connector plugged in over here. Make sure that firmly clicks in place. And then you also have this connector off to the side. That one's good. That's that. And then these two go to the top of the fan shroud right like that. All right, this would probably be a good time to go install the turbo inlet that goes to the air box. You could certainly go ahead and put the rest of the radiator fan cover back on, but leaving that out will give us a little bit more room to get down to that turbo inlet. So let's grab that and get that ready to be installed. Let's go ahead and reinstall this clip. Once that's in place, we can go ahead and drop that in. If you recall, there was also a little breather hose from the PCV system that has to get attached when this is still somewhat loose. So we do need to get this fitting on the breather hose in first before we fully engage this charge pipe or this turbo inlet here. So once that's firmly in place, it's definitely able to be turned a little bit and adjusted into place. So we have mass airflow sensor connector out of the way. There's a couple of coolant hoses that are going to get stuck into here, right there. We have another one down here in the front from the auxiliary water pump. Those are kind of going to help keep this in place. And then we also have that breather hose that's going to go down to the turbo and also hold this harness in place. All right, now we've got our PCV hose. We're going to feed this down onto that turbo inlet, guiding that into place. And then there's another breather line as well. So let's get it pressed onto the turbo inlet real quick, and then we'll engage that little side piece. There we go, nice firm click. And to help this click into place a little bit easier, a little bit of grease on that O-ring will be all the assistance that we need. So hopefully this falls into place now. There we go, it clicked in. Cool. And then we're gonna put this harness around this breather hose as well and click this into place up top. This is attached down here. That. There we go. Now before you install your air box, make sure that A, you have the 3 pegs, they're not broken off from removal, and B, that the 3 orange plugs are firmly pressed into the body. And if they're on the air box still, you'll want to transfer those over, as it will not click into place correctly. So there's also the air inlet here that will need to click into this ducting in the front. So just pay close attention to that. Kind of sliding it into that air ducting. We will need to pull this back just a little bit, lining up all those pegs, and everything should fall into place. It will click into the air duct and press onto those grommets all at the same time. Now for the airbox connection up here, make sure the rubber doesn't kind of fold on the bottom there. You may have to run your hand along the bottom to make sure that that does not occur. And we're going to attach this little air muffler here to the back of the airbox there. And with the T20 screw that you removed, go ahead and put that back into place. I'm just going to use a little screwdriver here and tighten it up by hand, as the torque spec is only about 3 Newton meters. And it's just a placeholder, it's not sealing anything. There we go. And then with a 6mm, we're going to tighten up this clamp Again, this clamp is about 2.5 Newton meters, not very tight either. And then take connector, click that into place, lock the white lock, and now we're ready to start reassembling the front radiator cover. All right, go ahead and grab your upper radiator support bracket and lay that across the top, tucking it on the driver's side underneath the hood cable. And before we go ahead and drop the bolts in, you may remember the harness down here was attached, the coolant hose down here was attached, so keep that in mind and get those fitted before it's too late. It's definitely a little easier to do it while it's still loose so you can kind of find the hole. So now, if you recall, we did remove 4 13mm bolts from the top of this radiator support brace. However, the replacement bolts, and they are required replacement bolts, are an E14, and they do come equipped with some Loctite. So we'll get these all started, and we're going to be torquing these down to 56 Newton meters. Once we get these in, we do want to start with the front ones and pull that forward and get it into its resting position. And the reason we did that is because if you were to tighten these down now, and you still have a gap between here, you're either going to pull the threads out of that radiator support brace or simply bend the hood latch brackets. So we will push this against the hood latch brackets, we'll snug up these bolts real quick, and then we'll go back and torque down those E14s. Grab the 4 T30s for the front of these. So we're just going to run these bolts in until they're flush. We don't need to torque them just yet. We're going to go back and do those E14s. Now we can go through and do the 56 Newton meters on all 4 of these. And there's no right or wrong way to do it, but I'm going to do the 2 inner ones first, and then I'll go back and do the outside ones. All right. Now, once we've gone ahead and done the 56 Newton meters on those outer E14s, we're going to go back and do a 90-degree turn. And now the T30s in the front are going to be tightened to 8 Newton meters. All right. We do have a little harness over here that I did forget to clip back into place. So before we put that cover back on, just take a second to make sure all of your harnesses are clipped back into the support brace. There we go. Now we're going to have to hold the hood cable up out of the way and put it on that aluminum top cover here. Keep in mind that that is going to have some locating pins for this radiator. So if it does cause any binding or anything like that, we may need to take these off and inspect these little bushings here, which could potentially roll in on themselves. So a little bit of lubricant there would probably help with installation, but we should be good to drop that in. So just make sure those pins are dropping into those slots there. It may even be a little bit easier to guide them with your finger. There we go. Should just drop into place, and then we'll pull this cable back over. We'll get that re-engaged once we get all those T30s tightened back up. All right, I'm just going to run these down real quick, and then we're going to go back and torque them down to 11.8 Newton meters. All right, and once we have that re-secured, we're just going to clip this hood cable back under those little tabs. Make sure it's slacked pretty well. All right, so we're going to start with these rear panels that kind of tuck underneath the hood hinge here. And then our driver's side panel. And this one does sit underneath the rear panel. And if you recall, the hood seal does have a couple of clips in there. Go ahead and press those in now. And then that'll sit like that. And then start putting the plastic rivets in. Now, on this side, you may remember the washer cap is on that side, so we'll just pop that off real quick. It does just push towards the opening of the washer reservoir and engage on this little tab here. So if you're having trouble, you can certainly stretch the trim panel around that, but it'll definitely be easier without that in our way. So just like we pulled it out, tip it under the hood, engaging it into that fender there. Get this all lined up. It should squeeze over top of that. Grab your washer cap, and once you get it in that groove, pull back and then pop that back on. And we'll grab our other trim panel and start putting those plastic rivets back in. And then we'll engage our hood seal, and I already noticed this front one starting to come out. These clips do stay in any of these and come out of the hood seal. It is just this little football shape. You can kind of wedge it into the seal, stretching it a little bit, and get that to sink back in, just like so. There we go there. And then just like the other side, put your plastic clips back in. All right, we now have our strut braces ready to go back on. You're going to be putting the E14 on the strut tower, and the 16 millimeter is going to be going up on the strut brace. And the strut brace on the front here is going to have the flat edge, and the curved edge on the rear will go to the strut tower. Should not be able to tip up in the rear. If you'll notice, this is kind of sitting at an angle here, and this is kind of pointing up. So flip that over, and that's how that one should sit. This one's similar, with the part number facing upwards. And now the 16s, as well as the E14s, are all going to get torqued to 56 Newton meters. And next up, we're going to be putting in our little corner cowl panels, and obviously ours is missing one of those thumb screws, so you're going to be dropping those in, turning those thumb screws 90 degrees. And now we're ready to go ahead and throw our engine cover on. Alrighty. Now, before we go ahead and put our belly pans back on, we're going to go ahead and fill the cooling system. So we've already verified that the cooling system does hold vacuum when we had everything apart, so this should be quite a simple process. We are just going to prime this line with some air over here, with this valve still open to your coolant bucket. I've got this a little bit higher than the reservoir. However, you want your coolant bucket, or your whatever you're mixing your coolant in. We have a 50-50 mixture in this bucket of the jug that was included, and then a jug of the distilled water. So we're going to just prime this up, keeping this submerged. Once that fills with coolant and then has no air bubbles left, we're ready to go ahead and vacuum the system. I've got the valve covered because it will be spraying a little bit of the coolant that was pulled over when primed. And we want to just pull vacuum up to about 25 inches of mercury. And we got it just about right over 25 to about 26. So if you haven't already, obviously you're going to let this sit for quite some time, making sure that there are no vacuum leaks. If there are, you may have to go back in there, check all of your O-rings, make sure all your seals are secured. But this should hold pretty good, so we're going to start filling the cooling system. Cracking this valve, letting that fill up. We have about 4 gallons in this bucket, 2 jugs of coolant and 2 jugs of the distilled water. We'll have plenty left over. However, the vehicle may take a little bit more than the 2 gallons, one being concentrate and one being the water. So keep that in mind. You may want to have some additional coolant, and it's always good to have a little bit hanging around in the garage in case you need some top off later. All right, we're pretty much out of vacuum. All right, we could certainly adjust the coolant level here. However, we will likely have an air pocket in the system, so it is good to have it a little bit above the max line. And we'll go over to the vehicle and show you how to do the coolant bleed procedure. Make sure your cap is installed securely, and we'll adjust that coolant level after the vehicle cools down and we go through that bleed procedure. All right, so since we did have a lot of components off, we're gonna start the vehicle briefly to make sure we have no connectors that we forgot to install, and make sure we have no check engine lights before going through with the coolant bleed procedure. So 3 with the start stop button, 1, 2, 3, our low beams on, our hazards on, hold the gas pedal all the way to the floor. You'll get diagnostic mode active, and then we should get a service function started. And now if the service function is actually started, the vehicle will idle slightly, and then the car will do everything else for you. So sit stationary in the vehicle, and the RPMs will raise, they will lower, and it'll go through this whole process for about 10 to 12 minutes. And this will go on for a few minutes, and then it'll come back down to idle. Monitor your coolant temperature, make sure the vehicle doesn't overheat during this process. And also make sure you have no fluid leaks underneath the car. All right, temperature is starting to climb, but we have done this before, and it will climb and drop and go right back down to vehicle cold. So keep in mind, and there it goes. The vehicle will take another 3 to 4 minutes of this process. So, all right, and when you hear that ding, you know you're all set. You will get a message that says service function finished, and hopefully you haven't fallen asleep in the front seat. With that, I did want to mention that I did forget to give you a small tidbit of information. When you're going through the process in the beginning, you have your low beams on and your hazards on. I also forgot to mention that you'll want your heater settings set to the highest temperature and your blower set to the single fan mode on the first position. And one more thing, if the vehicle has the Eco Pro mode selected, this function may not initiate. So keep that in mind. If you're having trouble getting this to start, there's a couple of other parameters that need to be engaged in order for this to actually operate. But now that we've got the cooling system bled and our temperature hasn't gone past the medium mark, we're gonna let this thing cool down. We'll adjust that coolant level and we'll put the belly pans back on the bottom of the car. There we go. All right, we're gonna start on the rear belly pan. And you should have a fairly large pile of these black 8mm screws. Get a couple of them started. Now these are not very tight. They do go into plastic speed nuts. About 3 Newton meters is the torque spec. All right, and I am gonna leave the rest of the front ones until we get our side panels and that front middle panel back installed. All right, now that pretty much wraps up today's DIY on the water pump replacement in the G01 X3 M40i. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If so, hit that like button. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, get down in the comments section below. And we'll have plenty more videos on this vehicle and many others like it, so don't forget to subscribe. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.